Hey everybody, it's the Metal, and today I want to talk about my problem with people's problems with self-inserts, right? And as somebody who, at least of the webcomic I'm working on, the main character is basically a self-insert because it's like a hyperbolized version of my own life and my friends involved. I think it's a subject I should and could talk about at quite great lengths. But I personally don't have a problem with self-inserts as a concept, as a tool. I do, on the other hand, have a problem with how most people handle them. And even going back, I think there have been a lot of characters, even in novels throughout history, that have been self-inserts you just didn't know that they were, purely from the fact that you didn't know the novelist or the author who made the character. Yeah. Sorry, I'm walking around outside, so there's noise and passerbys and stuff. But you didn't know who the novelist was? You didn't know who the author was who made the character or made the world? But I'm going to explain to you why it worked in their case. And also why it works better in my case than it does in most of the ones that you're used to and complain about. Part number one, right? And this is the most important part. The world that this character is in is an original world, right? Reading a novel, I mean, going back even before comics, right? Just going back to long-term storytelling, maybe even orally. It may take place in the real world, or a version of our Earth, but it's its own version of the Earth. It's an interesting world. It's not somebody else's creation. It's the creation of the writer. And that is a big thing. A lot of problems I have online, and especially diving into webcomics, I've been reading a lot of webcomics for a really, really long time, pretty much since webcomics have been webcomics. I've even said on many occasions that my favorite webcomic is, all time, was 8-Bit Theater. Not even like you would say the most artistic comic, because it was made with sprites of Final Fantasy in somebody else's world. But it is one of my favorite webcomics. But something I've noticed quite often is that the vast majority of webcomics that are popular take place in other people's created worlds, which you would think would demand a cease and desist, not that most people care, or maybe it just barely passes through parody laws. But they don't come up with their own original idea or anything like that, or the most original part of their idea is the tweak that they make to the world. And a lot of times, if it's a self-insert case, it's putting themselves into somebody else's world, which is not very interesting. Especially, like, the world was popular, and I'm about to give you reason number 2 on why it's not very interesting that they put themselves in somebody else's world, and why fan fictions suck. On average. Some of them are okay. I think some of the writers, their biggest issue is that they need help world building. They might need somebody else to work with, because they're really good at writing plots and stories, but the actual breading to the world blows. And they just need really help fleshing it out, coming up with original characters and settings and stuff like that. But the reason number 2 on why most self-inserts suck is that the person who's inserting themselves into the story isn't interesting, right? And that's a problem. You have this very interesting world that you probably ripped off from somebody, or even made your own very interesting world, which already gives you a step up. But you, as the writer, or the person in question that we're talking about, hasn't ever done anything in life. You're just somebody sitting there who enjoyed other people's works or whatever, want to be a really creative person, got all these ideas in your head, but you don't even know if these ideas are good or not, because you have no real world experiences to flex them upon, and you probably don't have other people to tell these stories to before you write them, to actually check to see if you have an entertaining idea. And you're going out there and you start writing yourself in this world the way you think it would be cool, but you're not an interesting person. Like for me, one of the examples I have for why I'm more interesting than most people is because I've actually lived a pretty interesting life up until the point that I'm in right now. Even going back all the way to when I was a kid, you know, I was active, I was in scouts, I was volunteering, I was in sports, I was in martial arts, practicing different forms of combat since I was like 5 years old. I'm a hiker, I'm an adventurer, I go everywhere. Been on cross-country road trips, you know. I work with my hands. I've done a lot of manual labor. I am actually a freelancer in many regards. I've done a lot of different variety jobs. I'm not like a specialist, I'm a variety guy. But I'm good at almost everything that I do. And I do have a history with underground fighting. The name The Metal actually predates my use of it in fiction and my use of it online. It actually has quite a few different meanings for it, and it's come up as a nickname for me on multiple separate occasions that the people didn't even know about the nickname between each other. I've got tons of stories about myself that I could tell that are interesting in a real world setting. And that's the real kicker too. You got to ask yourself, before you decide to put yourself in a story, be it your own or in somebody else's world, are you in fact somebody who would be interesting to read about or watch or be engaged with outside of this fantasy setting? Because if you have an interesting world and put a not very interesting person in there, they're already going to be the least interesting thing about that world by default. And that does not make good storytelling. That doesn't make an entertaining faction. It's really hard to build a fan base on that. But if you are a very interesting person, and even if the world's more interesting than them, they may not be the least interesting thing in the world. In fact, they might still be one of the most interesting things in the world. So you do have to ask yourself, would somebody read about me in real life? Because if they wouldn't read about you in real life, like if you can't tell a story about your own life and entertain people, and you actually being the subject of the story, then people probably aren't going to be entertained by that person being thrown into some fantastical world. That's just the bare bones end of the day problem to it, you know? So those are the two really big facets. Half the time, either it's somebody else's world that you're just throwing yourself into, and the other half is going with it, you're just not very interesting. Or I'm not talking about you specifically unless you happen to be one of those people, just whoever we're specifically talking about. And that's my problem with people's problems with self-inserts. Like, I guarantee you in a couple of Ernest Hemingway stories, he probably changed the main character's name, but the main character was in self-insert from him, and you'd never know it unless you knew his life. But Ernest Hemingway was a very, very interesting person. You know, he was a tough guy that even like professional boxers didn't want to box. He went shark hunting for fun. Because of his, I think it was a sight problem, he wasn't allowed to actually be in the infantry or anything. But he somehow convinced them to let him drive the ambulance and put a gun, like a turret, on the back of it. Like, Hemingway was a very interesting guy. And I'm almost positive that in a few of his stories, the characters were just him. And you'd never know it, unless you knew about him. So yeah. And here's the problem too. You might be an interesting person that just can't come up with an interesting world, and that's not a problem either. This is why you work on teams, all right? A lot of people who even have autobiographies done, who have had very, very amazing lives that people want to read about, often get somebody else to write it for them. So yeah, I'm rambling too on, but I just hate the stigma that self-inserts get. It's not the problem with the concept, it's the problem with the person writing it. And read X Dynamis Chaos. Pretty much just an advertisement for that. I'll moving on to the bonus side in between chapter, Hymn of Valor. It's fun. Bye.